your, do you like to call it an autobiography or memoirs?
Autobiography.
Why do you want to call it that?
Well, because I think that's an accurate statement of my attempt to summarise my life.
And why now? Why did you decide to do it now?
Well, I didn't have time to do it earlier on. It has a disadvantage that many of my contemporaries are now dead, and therefore it would have been better had I done it 20 years ago, but I was too busy to do it, and it got to a point where I had to get cracking on it if I was going to make any progress.
Anybody who looks at it, anybody indeed who flicks through the photographs, as some people are tempted to do, the photographs of family back to the 18th century, was it you who made sure that these were archived and kept?
Yes. I had the good fortune that my mother kept photographs beforehand, but when my maternal grandmother died, I gave my father an immediate instruction he wasn't to throw anything away that was in her possession, and I took it all over. And I have collected a lot of family information, and I've also done a lot of research on the family.
Who, from an early age, were you politically aware from an early age?
Well, I remember the 1930s. I remember the bombing of Spain and hearing about that, and I didn't make up my mind until I was 18 years of age where my politics were, but I was aware of public affairs, and my parents took the News Chronicle, and I remember accordingly reading news of what was happening, and I remember my father being down in the dumps when he knew Chamberlain was coming on to declare war. I heard the declaration of war from Neville Chamberlain. I used to listen to Winston Churchill's speeches throughout the war, and subsequently my mother was a Conservative, and when I realised the backwardness of conditions before me and what the Liberals had done, I first of all became a Liberal. But when I read and studied, I realised that you had to have much more far-reaching changes than the Liberals were proposing, and therefore I became a socialist, and I remain one to this day.
And what your first steps into actually being a representative, did you start off in council, or how did that come about?
No, what I did was I participated in political work. I joined the Labour Society when I went to university in 1948, and I joined the Labour Party in 1949, and I never thought anything about representing people particularly. I thought was merely engaged in the campaigns, and I stood for the council once in an unwinnable seat in Stoke-on-Trent, but I was the agent for the Labour Party up till 1959 in this constituency for 3 years, and it was only after that that some of my colleagues said, would you be prepared to stand? And then I agreed to stand. So I was actually more or less 30 years of age before I seriously became a candidate.
So again, going way back, so when you stood for the first time, can you recall classically what were the type of issues on the doorstep?
Oh yes, I mean I didn't stand, I stood for Parliament for the first time in 1964 when I was 34 years of age, and I was very much supporting the ideas of the Labour Party at that particular time to improve social services, to take certain industries into public ownership and to improve the standard of living in this country.
And do you remember your first day in Parliament? Can you still visualise that?
I remember the first meetings. Some days in Parliament were, shall we say, very routine days. I mean, going in and standing and waiting to take the oath was not a particularly exhilarating process in itself. I remember making my first speech in Parliament, and I was called to make a maiden speech immediately after the main business of the House, and I was somewhat taken aback because everybody walked out. However, it wasn't a particularly sign of any discourtesy to me. It was that I was called just at the point when people largely left the chamber, and I remember that. And of course, when I was speaking, I was aware of the fact that other people were waiting to speak, and their main concern was not to listen to my words of wisdom, but to hope that I'd sit down quickly so that they could be called.
Sorry to go through this and have a lot of broad strokes, but there's a lot to get through. From from the 30s up say to the 60s, who were your political, not used in modern word of idols, but your mentors, the people you looked up for and influenced by?
Look, I made up my own mind. I never sought a patron or anything of the sort. Throughout my life, I mean, when I was 18 years of age, I registered as a conscientious objector. And then I realised, because I was against war, that I wasn't against force entirely, and that if they asked me questions, I would certainly say that one had to fight in certain circumstances. I was totally against the Korean War, and therefore I refused to go in the army. I made up my own mind on that. I wasn't against national service. I felt a debt to my country, and I therefore volunteered to go in the mines, and I worked largely on the coalface for 4 years instead of 2 years. And when I came to the House of Commons, I made up my own mind. But I was certainly on the left and I associated with a number of people who were left-wingers like Michael Foot and Ian Mikado, Eric Heffer and so on. And I was one of the founder members of the Tribune group, with 6 of us who founded that, and I was one of those. And I continued to be somebody on the left. For example, when I was elected in 1964, a Labour government continued to support the American military campaign in Vietnam. Now, I thought that was appalling, and therefore I spoke out against it. And I did a lot of work on that issue. And although I was associated with other people, I never looked for a patron. I made up my own mind.
You mentioned Tribune, you mentioned socialism. Some say that young MPs who came in 1983, like Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Peter Mandelson, looked around at the party and said this is virtually unelectable. And they felt they needed to transform it and use these terms. Were they right?
They're absolutely wrong. I think that the Labour Party, on its traditional basis, did a tremendous amount to change society in this country. If you look at life before 1945 and what happened afterwards, we had houses built throughout the country. For example, in this new town, we had the National Health Service, we had welfare benefits brought in, we had industrial injuries and so on improved, and people's standard of life was immensely changed by the Labour government, and that continued. And the idea that Tony Blair had of New Labour, of somehow going onto opinion polls and merely trying to get the middle ground, was wrong. And what we've seen, unfortunately, under the Conservatives and Labour, is increasing inequality in our country since that date, lot of permanent unemployment, and we certainly haven't improved because of New Labour.
And indeed, some say that Margaret Thatcher said that her greatest achievement was Tony Blair. Would that make you weep?
Well, I'm very sad that Tony Blair with New Labour came in. I think that what Margaret Thatcher did was destructive of the standards of the mass of the people of this country, and obviously I didn't agree with the work that she did. She sold off the nationalised industries, or most of them, and they're now owned by companies based abroad, which is totally wrong. And if we look, for example, at what's being done by the 6 energy companies at the present time, in making it impossible for people, as even the former Prime Minister said, to eat as well as to keep warm in certain cases, I don't think that anybody can say that the privatisation that Margaret Thatcher carried through was to the benefit of the majority of the people in this land.
But looking at this constituency of Harlow that you represented for a long time, it's one of the classic weather vane seats, isn't it? A swing seat. There's something about the Conservative Party, whether it's Margaret Thatcher, etc., and we're here to talk about you, not Margaret Thatcher, but why do you think Harlow's become such a swing seat?
Well, because, frankly, because people gained the benefits of coming here, and they took them all for granted. I mean, when I was, for example, canvassing last time, I called on a person who was obviously a pensioner, and I asked if she was going to support Labour, and she said, no, she said, what have they ever done for me? I said, you've got this house with all my cons. I said, do you get free service in the National Health Service? Do you not get your heating allowance? Do you not get free transport? And all those things she'd taken for granted, and didn't attribute any of the work that was done fighting for those to Labour.
Do you think Harlow's changed in a good way or a bad way over the years?
Well, it's changed, and some things are good and some things are regrettable. I very much regret that when the Development Corporation was wound up, that the council did not receive the benefits, to some extent at least, of the industrial and commercial areas, because there wasn't enough money in the kitty to refurbish the town as it should have been refurbished when it came of age, and I think that was a pity.